God ordered genocide, committed infanticide, fratricide, mass murder, etc. The problem with this statement is that with every example or citation that they would give for war described in the Old Testament, there is a difference between murder and killing. There is a difference between war and genocide. There is a difference between ordering mass murder and judgment as the giver and taker of life. If you're demanding, and this is the first problem, that God play by the same rules as you are assuming that God is you, and thus must play by the moral standards and laws he has imposed on you. But saying that because you aren't allowed to play God, that God isn't allowed to be God, is unreasonable. And here are the facts that are on the table. When someone says God committed genocide, what do you mean by genocide? The mass killing of someone based on their genus? You would have to demonstrate in Scripture that because of their genetics, they were exterminated. But this isn't the case. Generally, when they want to point out these instances of genocide or mass murder, these aren't actually historical descriptors, but emotive terms that are used to demonstrate, and reasonably so, acts of evil. And if they can accuse God of them, then they conclude that God is evil, thus a concept that is in a contradiction within itself. The standard of all good and morality can't be evil, so it must not exist. But here's the problem. When someone makes a claim of violence in the Old Testament, and it had a historical context of war, and on top of that was only enacted after hundreds, plural, of years of mercy, and only directed toward specific cultures, not genes, not specific races or ethnicities or age groups of people, but people that were aware of what they were doing and would warrant the consequences thereof. If I tell you not to do something and you do it anyway, that is your fault because I rightly warned you. If you continue to do something that is legitimately harmful, say for example the worshiping of idols that were done through child prostitution, bloodletting of both members and opposers of your religion, infant sacrifice, and dedicating homes by smashing the skulls of infants and burning them alive through ovens, and putting up with this for centuries, I would call you extremely patient and wonder why you didn't annihilate these people sooner. But here's the point. When we look at examples of warfare in the Old Testament, I can name 7. Canaan and the war against the Canaanites by Joshua. When people say that that was an act of genocide, that the genus of the Canaanites was targeted by God for no good reason, this is simply ignorant of the facts. All the way back at the time of Abraham in the 20th century BC, which by the way is around 600 years before Joshua entered Canaan in 1410 BC, according to the archaeological evidence we've uncovered of the ruins of Jericho, of which was their first battle. We have been given, and you can look up these passages on your own time. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 20, we read that Abraham was not only told that the specific people groups that had been warned by God and would continue to be warned by God, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, and so forth, all of these people that Israel would then go to war with upon the exhaustion of these second chances would then face judgment, not genocide. And for what reason? Because of their non-Jewishness, or because of the fact that they were committing these sort of actions? The worship of idols didn't just constitute bowing down to an ugly statue. It involved honoring the aspects that they represented, which Molech, Ashtoreth, and Baal have already been cited as the 3 main deities, and were worshipped through those ways, through actual infanticide, through actual child prostitution, through actual bloodletting and murder of people based on what they believed. Now, these people weren't just punished for what they believed, but knowing that what they believed was false and committing atrocities in their name anyway. The action, say for example, of arresting a Muslim wasn't done because the individual believed something that America doesn't approve of. Religious freedom is preserved. But if your religious commands order you to commit murder and explain it as a means of achieving favor in the eyes of your God, we don't arrest you for being not American. We don't arrest you for being Muslim. We committed an action, or rather they committed an action known as murder. They refer to it as jihad, but they committed an act of murder, and they will be charged for it irrespective or distant from their beliefs. So understand that point. If you're given 600 years of mercy, by the way, I think that is going beyond the realm of generous, and also puts the level of responsibility on the people who knew better, knew the consequences, and yet did it anyway. God punished these people. And also note as well, when I read the accounts in Joshua, we have not only one family, like Rahab's, who asked for mercy and then were given it, but even entire people groups like the Gibeonites, who asked for mercy from God, albeit under some rather shady circumstances, but because they asked for mercy and God gave it to them, I'd consider that generous, not a result of a genocidal dictator. Also note, the Amalekites are also noted because they are a specific people group that were singled out by name by God as to be perpetual enemies with Israel. So did God force them to basically commit to these actions and thus warranted the consequences? No. According to Exodus 17, 8 through 16, again, Exodus 17 verses 8 through 16, Israel's first encounter with the Amalekites wasn't observing their skin color or their non-Jewishness and saying, we ought to kill all those people one day. No, it was actually the exact opposite. The Amalekites saw the people of Israel wandering through the wilderness and decided to attack their rear guard, which, by the way, wasn't guarded. That was where the old, the young, and the infirm were generally to be found, and thus attacking people who couldn't attack them back. This was terrorism. And when Israel fought back and was given victory, God cursed the Amalekites and informed them that if they continued this behavior, they would deserve judgment. And what do you know? After 400 years, during the time of Saul in the 11th century BC, we were given an order to wipe them out and not spare man, woman, or child. Paul Copan, in his book, Is God a Moral Monster?, notes that the language used in this was probably to suggest to specifically attack their military targets, but I respectfully disagree. When these people were meant to be exterminated, removed from the face of the earth, not even to spare their cattle, we have a specific follow-up example in the book of 1 Samuel where Saul spared some cattle, some citizens, and especially their king, King Agag. And he wasn't happy about it. He had deliberately disobeyed an order that would have far-reaching consequences for the nation of Israel in the future, and we read that in the book of Esther. Now, what kind of people were the Amalekites, and were they the ones that deserved a second chance? Well, let's make an observation and see what the survivors took from their ancestors after another 400 years of second chances, from the time of Saul all the way to Esther when they had moved into captivity in Persia. A man by the name of Haman, who is an Agagite. By the way, that's a reference to King Agag. He was one of the last surviving strains of Amalekites that had fled from Israel after Saul disobediently spared them. And interestingly enough, he was the type of politician who wanted to host daily parades for himself, where he was paraded through the streets and ordered people to worship him. Now, a single Jewish man, let me say that again, a single Jewish man by the name of Mordecai heard about these parades and decided to just go home on a street other than that one, so he didn't have to bow down. And Haman was none the wiser. One of his servants informed his wife, and his wife informed him that this man Mordecai, who's a Jew, doesn't want to attend your daily worship me parades. And Haman's Amalekite mindset somehow led that to motivate him to want to exterminate his entire race. So let me just narrow this down for you. The Amalekites were the sort of people who mentally and culturally processed information that if one person doesn't give them their propers, I'm going to exterminate everyone who has that genetic signature. That sounds like genocide, but does it for God? And that's the point. Also note not only why God did consider these people the sort of ones to be reasoned with, but gave them 800 years of second chances, one of which wasn't necessary. But here's the point. That's not genocide. That's justice after 400 years of second chances, and on top of that, they got another 400 years and only showed to us exactly why God didn't think these people could be reasoned with anymore. But here's the point. Going on to the Philistines, who were given a warning by Samuel in the 10th century BC, were told, and note this as well, that when they were given this warning, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't used by God, the Babylonians, to wipe them out until the 600s. When we think of the people that Samson fought, those were the Philistines. When we think of the people that were oppressing Israel to need Samson to be risen up in order to combat them. When we think of Goliath and the reason why the Philistines were trying to enslave the nation of Israel and continued to be not just a thorn but a tent stake in Israel's side, attempting to kill them since the moment they entered into their land, then you start to realize, oh, God was putting up with these people's murderous tendencies towards his nation for centuries. And Nebuchadnezzar, 400 years later, noticing a trend, finally called them out on it. But the Jews weren't ordered by God to exterminate them. They fought them in various wars, but they weren't the instigators. The Assyrians, the Ninevites, as they're oftentimes referred to. Nineveh was the Assyrian capital, and Assyria, as we know it today, is generally found in northern Syria, southern Turkey. But the point being is that they were given a warning by Nahum in the 700s BC. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take them over until the 600s. You also may be familiar with a prophet by the name of Jonah. He also warned them, and they repented and were given mercy by God, even though they were scheduled for judgment in 40 days after his message. Because they asked for mercy, they were given mercy. But then at the time of Nahum, generations had passed from the people who took God's word for it and saying, oh, there are consequences for our actions. What if we say we're sorry? They were given mercy. When they didn't learn from their ancestors' mistakes and decided to go back into their barbaristic tendencies, which you can read about in Herodotus's Annals of History, you're going to realize that these people were given far too much in not only 1 but 2 centuries, if you count Jonah, of second chances. Babylon was given a warning by Isaiah in 700 BC. Alexander the Great didn't take them over until the 300s BC, and it's also worth noting that when Nebuchadnezzar was risen up by God, according to the book of Habakkuk, for his tool of judgment, they didn't get away with the war crimes they committed during that time. Just because you're commissioned by God doesn't mean you get away with murder either. It almost sounds consistent. Israel was given a warning by Moses in 1410 BC, and Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, didn't take them away into captivity for their idolatry, their murderous tendencies towards the prophets of Israel. See King Ahab and Manasseh. We'll get to him in a moment as well. But all of these individuals that were doing the sort of horrible things that would warrant judgment and a legal response from the creator of the universe to which they were morally accountable to. But if I do my subtraction correctly, 1410 BC, time of Deuteronomy, and where Moses warned them that if you do this, then God is going to judge you. You are aware of not only his standards, but the consequences thereof. When did Sennacherib take them over again? That would have been in the 700s. 700 plus years of mercy was given to the Jewish people before they experienced judgment. And note, in the meantime, the only sort of consequences they faced were the natural results. They refused God's standards, and he didn't protect them from the nations that were brutalizing them. When they turned back to him, he's raised up a deliverer, but they didn't experience ultimate judgment until a set time. Oftentimes centuries, in fact, regularly centuries after the fact. The same was true for the southern two tribes of Israel that were broken off from when the northern 10 tribes of Israel went into a civil war with the son of Solomon named Rehoboam. They were given a warning by Moses in 1410 BC as well, but because they held to God's standards a little longer than the northern 10 tribes did, they weren't judged until the 600s by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. But you're noticing that there's a trend here. Every single time that acts of violence in a massive scale are recorded in the Old Testament, they're in the context of war. They are not the instigators, but in response to aggression. They are never enacted towards people who weren't aware of what they were doing was wrong. And with verse citation, we could note that every single time God judged these people, it was only after centuries of second chances. The same was true for Noah and the flood. They were given 120 years to not only see the ark, but know exactly what it was for. Because violence was covering the face of the earth, God was going to judge it, lest mankind wipe himself out. Who were the ones who took advantage of the ark? Those who got on it before God closed the door. Oh, God, so cruel for giving people a second chance, but them refusing it. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But if you're going to call God a genocidal dictator, an infanticidal, fratricidal, mass murder, etc., at least know what you're talking about. Because when we actually look at these passages and consider why this violence took place, we're given centuries of second chances, and that's almost unreasonable in the opposite direction, not an accusation of murder. Thank you for your time, and again, if you want specific verse citation, historical examples, and walking through these sort of things, leave them in the comments below. As long as you're sincere, I'll be happy to go through them with you. But make sure that if you are not only hearing, but also even leveling these sort of accusations in the Bible, at least have the guts to read the Bible rather than a clip from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and noting as well how even his fellow atheists considered it a joke when it came to the logical consistencies he employed in his objections to God. I will look forward to talking to you next time about these objections, and until then, God bless you, and I hope and continue to pray that he not only shows mercy on our nation, but noting that as well, that he is a just God, and that we can be grateful that he has a high preference for mercy.